The first thing he noticed was the cold. It wasn't the biting, skin-numbing kind, but something worse, a deep, stagnant chill that settled into his bones, as if the walls themselves were exhaling their icy breath. His wrists ached from the jagged metal cuffs digging into them, and his head throbbed where someone had struck him. The taste of iron sat heavy on his tongue, blood his own. He blinked against the dim light filtering through the narrow slits in the stone ceiling. The cell was small, damp, and smelled of mildew and old sweat. The floor beneath him was hard, uneven, and slick with something he didn't want to identify. A low hum, the sound of an energy barrier, pulsed behind the iron bars of his prison. Beyond them, alien voices murmured, their sharp consonants and guttural vowels bouncing off the cold walls. He didn't need to understand their language to know what they were saying. The laughter, the sneering tones, it was all the same, no matter the species. A shadow shifted outside the cell. One of the guards, a hulking creature with chitinous armor plating and an extra set of eyes on its elongated skull, stepped closer. It wrapped its clawed fingers against the barrier, amused by the sight of him shackled on the floor. "You reek of sweat and fear, human," the creature rasped in heavily accented standard. "They said you were dangerous, but you look like a caged beast. Weak. Pathetic." He didn't react. He had spent too long in places like this to rise to such bait. Instead, he tilted his head, taking in the other figures standing just beyond the light. More of them. They all bore the same insignia on their armor, some military crest, no doubt. One of them, smaller than the others, but with an air of authority, stepped forward. The markings on its armor gleamed under the dim lighting, gold etched into dark plating. Its eyes, black and predatory, studied him with detached curiosity. "This is the one?" it asked, voice smooth, almost lazy. The guard nodded. "Caught him after he tore through a scouting party. We lost 3 warriors before he finally went down." The officer crouched just outside the bars, close enough that he could see the subtle twitch of its mandibles. "Is that true, human? Did you kill my men?" He exhaled slowly through his nose, refusing to look away. "If they're dead, they weren't your men for long." The guard snarled and reached for its weapon, but the officer raised a hand, stopping it. A sharp, rasping chuckle escaped its throat. "Bold, arrogant. You speak like a warrior, but you lie there in chains like a defeated animal." Still, he said nothing. Let them talk. Let them think whatever they wanted. Words were nothing. The officer's gaze drifted lower, toward his exposed arms. The remnants of his torn combat gear did little to hide the marks that ran along his skin, lines and symbols carved deep into his flesh, some old, some fresh. "What is this?" The officer reached forward, tracing a clawed finger near the markings, but not touching. The others stepped closer, curiosity replacing mockery. One of them muttered something in their native tongue. Another let out a low whistle, the kind reserved for something impressive or unsettling. He remained still as they studied him. The officer's eyes narrowed. "These are kill tallies," it said at last, voice quieter now, the lazy amusement gone. "These symbols, they're not random. Each one marks a life taken, doesn't it?" A ripple of unease passed through the gathered warriors. "He wears them like a hunter's trophies," one muttered. "No," another corrected, a hint of disbelief in their tone. "Like a ledger, a record." Silence thickened the air. The officer tilted its head, considering. "How many?" it finally asked. He let a slow, deliberate smile tug at the corner of his lips. "Count them yourself." The officer's mandibles clicked together. He could see the hesitation now, the way they shifted slightly, as if re-evaluating the situation. One of the guards took an unconscious step back. The officer noticed. A flicker of irritation passed across its face, but it didn't reprimand them. That told him enough. For the first time since they had thrown him into this cell, he saw something new in their eyes. Not mockery, not arrogance, recognition, and just beneath that, fear. The officer straightened, but there was a stiffness in its posture now, a carefulness that hadn't been there before. It looked at him differently, not as a prisoner, but as something else. "Bring him to the warlord," it ordered, voice sharp. "Now." The guards hesitated for a fraction of a second before snapping to attention. The energy barrier dropped with a crackling hum. Heavy hands grabbed him, pulling him to his feet. He rolled his shoulders, feeling the tension in his muscles, the dull ache of old wounds. His restraints remained, but it no longer mattered. Because the moment they had recognized those marks, the moment they had understood what they meant, everything had changed. He wasn't just another captured enemy. He was something else entirely, and they knew it. The procession through the warship's halls was silent. Not the comfortable quiet of discipline, but the uneasy hush of men marching alongside something they didn't quite understand. The guards kept their weapons close, though none dared to touch him now. Not after what they'd seen. He could feel their eyes, flickering between his face and the tally marks carved into his skin. The officer who had first noticed them, he had a name now, Jorik, walked slightly ahead, shoulders squared, his gait rigid. He wanted to project confidence, but his claws tapped against the hilt of his blade in an unconscious display of tension. The corridor opened into a grand chamber, its walls lined with banners of deep crimson and black. The air smelled of burning oils and metal, the scent of war lingering like a second skin. At the far end, seated atop a raised platform of polished stone, was the warlord. He was massive even for his kind. Thick armor plating covered his body, layered with ceremonial etchings that gleamed under the dim lighting. His eyes, deep-set and watchful, locked onto him the moment he entered. Around him, elite warriors stood in rigid formation, their hands resting lightly on the hilts of their weapons. Jorik stepped forward and bowed. "Warlord Var, we bring you the human." Var studied him, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he rose to his full height, stepping down from the platform with the heavy grace of something that had seen more battlefields than it could count. "They tell me you are dangerous," Var said, his voice like grinding stone, "that your skin carries the weight of your kills." The guards behind him stiffened, waiting for a response. He gave them none. Var's mandibles twitched in amusement. Silent. Not out of fear, I think. The warlord reached out, slow and deliberate, and traced a clawed finger over one of the tally marks near his collarbone. "A veteran's mark. A commander's kill." "This one," Var murmured. "It belongs to one of ours, doesn't it?" He met the warlord's gaze, unreadable. Var chuckled, stepping back. "How many?" He shrugged. "I stopped counting." A low murmur spread through the gathered warriors. Var, however, remained motionless, observing him with something that was neither anger nor admiration. "You fought my kind before," the warlord said. "It was not a question. I fought anyone who needed killing." That, finally, earned a reaction. A sharp bark of laughter, spoken like a true warrior. But then Var's amusement faded, his gaze sharpening. "And yet you sit in chains." The weight of the bindings burned against his wrists. He could have answered in 100 different ways. He could have told them that war wasn't about who was the best fighter, but who got caught off guard first. He could have reminded them that even the deadliest predator could be trapped if the hunters were patient enough. Instead, he said, "Chains don't change what I am." Var nodded slowly, considering. Then, without breaking eye contact, he spoke a single command. "Release him." Jorik hesitated. "Warlord." "Now." The guards moved reluctantly, unlocking the restraints and stepping back quickly, as if expecting him to lunge for their throats. He didn't move, didn't rub at his wrists, didn't shift his stance. Var watched him a moment longer, then turned to his warriors. "This human has slain more of our kind than most of you will ever face in battle," he said, his voice carrying through the hall. "Some of you see a beast, a creature that kills without honor." He paused, then looked back at him. "I see something else." The room was silent. Even Jorik was still, his earlier confidence now laced with uncertainty. Var stepped forward, lowering his voice so only he could hear. "Some will call for your death. They will see you as a threat that must be put down." A pause. "But others will see you as a challenge." The weight of those words settled between them. He knew what was coming before Var even spoke it aloud. "Prove to them that you are worthy of standing among us," the warlord said, "or die by their hands." A test. A duel. Of course. He let out a slow breath, rolling his shoulders. Fine. Var grinned. It was not a kind expression. Jorik stepped forward, his posture stiff. I will fight him. The air shifted. Some of the warriors in the hall let out quiet murmurs. Others smirked, exchanging knowing glances. Var's gaze flickered to Jorik. You are certain? Jorik's jaw was tight, his mandibles twitching slightly. I do not fear him. A lie. He could see it in the way Jorik's fingers flexed slightly at his sides. He wasn't afraid of the fight. He was afraid of what it would mean if he lost. Var nodded. Then so be it. The room was cleared in minutes. A wide circle was drawn on the polished stone, the space between them now nothing more than empty air. Jorik stripped off the heavier parts of his armor, leaving only what was necessary. A ceremonial act, one that said, I am not hiding behind steel. He didn't have that luxury. He had only the tattered remains of his combat gear and the years of battle written into his muscles. Jorik drew his blade, a sleek, curved weapon with a serrated edge. He turned it in his grip, rolling his shoulders as he stepped forward. Let's see if your marks are anything more than scars. The crowd watched with eager eyes, waiting for the moment steel met flesh. He smiled. Then he moved. The first strike was fast. Jorik was quick, more experienced than the younger warriors who had dragged him through the halls. But speed wasn't everything. He sidestepped, letting the blade carve through empty air. Jorik was already pivoting, adjusting, his footwork sharp and precise. Good. He caught Jorik's next strike with his forearm, ignoring the sting as the edge bit shallowly into flesh. Then, before the alien could react, he twisted, grabbing Jorik's wrist, yanking him forward, and driving his elbow into the side of his skull. Jorik staggered, vision flickering. He didn't let him recover. A sharp kick to the knee sent him down. The blade clattered to the floor. Silence. He stepped back, tilting his head. Pick it up. Jorik hesitated. The weight of watching eyes pressed down on him. Pride and expectation wrapped around his throat like a vice. He reached for the blade. Var's voice cut through the silence. Enough. Jorik froze. The warlord stepped forward, looking between them before his gaze settled on Jorik. He had the chance to kill you. And yet, you still breathe. A beat of silence. Are you ready to accept what that means? Jorik's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Var nodded. Then, he turned to face him. You are no beast, the warlord said. But neither are you one of us. His voice dropped slightly. Not yet. The meaning was clear. This was not over. He glanced at Jorik, then at the crowd still watching in tense silence. Then he smiled. Good. Let them watch. Let them see. This was only the beginning. The first night outside the cell was not spent in celebration. There was no feast, no shared drink, no words of camaraderie. The warriors still watched him like a storm cloud on the horizon, distant, untrusted, but impossible to ignore. He had been given a place among them, though not as an equal. Not yet. His quarters were sparse, more of a holding space than true lodgings. A single cot, a worn table, and a small washing station that did little to remove the dried blood from his skin. His wounds were left untreated. Another test. If he wanted aid, he would have to earn it. He sat on the cot, rolling his shoulders, testing the stiffness in his muscles. Jorik's strike had left a dull ache beneath his ribs, a reminder that, for all his skill, he was still human, still breakable. A knock at the door. Sharp. Measured. He didn't bother answering. The door slid open anyway, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Jorik. The alien's stance was rigid, his mandibles tight. He had changed from his combat gear into a looser, more casual tunic, but the tension in his frame remained. They stared at each other for a long moment, neither speaking. Then Jorik exhaled sharply, stepping further inside. You should be dead. He leaned back against the cot, unbothered. Maybe. Jorik's gaze flickered to his arms, to the tally marks carved into his skin. You didn't finish the fight. I did. Jorik bared his teeth. You spared me. He tilted his head slightly. Would you have done the same? Silence. That was answer enough. Jorik shifted, the anger in his posture dimming, replaced with something more complicated. He wasn't used to this, being beaten, being spared. Among his kind, mercy was not a gift. It was an insult. Jorik clenched his jaw, then finally asked the question they had all been wondering. How many? He glanced down at his arms, at the etchings of past victories. Each one a life taken. A battle survived. Enough. Jorik scoffed. That's not an answer. He met the alien's gaze, unwavering. It's the only one that matters. Jorik held his stare for a moment longer before shaking his head. He muttered something in his native tongue, something low and bitter, then turned to leave. Just before stepping out, he paused. They will test you again, he said, quieter this time. You know that, don't you? He smiled. Let them. Jorik didn't reply. He simply left, the door sliding shut behind him. The days that followed were not peaceful. Var had not officially named him part of the clan, nor had he dismissed him as an outsider. He had been left in the space between watched, studied, tested. The first test had been the duel. The second was endurance. They sent him to train with their warriors, forcing him through the same brutal drills they had endured since childhood. They ran for miles across the ship's vast corridors, their armor weighing them down. They sparred with blunted weapons until their bodies ached, their bruises layered over old wounds. They lifted, pushed, pulled, climbed. Every movement meant to break lesser men. He kept up, barely. He wasn't stronger. He wasn't faster. But what he was relentless. He fell. He got up. He bled. He kept moving. The warriors whispered. They weren't ready to call him one of their own, but they had stopped calling him a beast. The third test came without warning. He had just finished a training session, sweat clinging to his skin, exhaustion weighing down his limbs, when the alarms blared. A voice echoed through the ship's speakers, sharp and urgent. A breach. A boarding party. The enemy had come to them. The warriors moved with trained efficiency, grabbing weapons, donning armor. No hesitation. No wasted movement. No one gave him a weapon. That was another test. He followed anyway. The corridors became war zones in an instant. Plasma fire scorched the walls, smoke thickening the air. Bodies fell, some allies, some intruders. The clash of steel against steel, the sharp scent of blood, the guttural cries of dying men. He didn't wait for an invitation. A warrior fell near him, his weapon skidding across the floor. He snatched it up without thought, rolling beneath a hail of fire before launching himself into the fray. His first kill was quick, a blade between the ribs. His second, slower. The third was a dance. A block, a feint, a twist of movement that left his enemy choking on their own blood. By the time the battle ended, his hands were stained red. The warriors around him took stock of their own losses, their own victories. Then they turned to him. Jorik was among them. He stared at the bodies around him, then at the humans still standing, bloodied but unbowed. This time he did not look away. Var arrived moments later, stepping over the fallen. He observed the battlefield, the broken corpses, the lingering scent of war. Then he turned to him. You fought, the warlord said. Not a question. A statement. He met Var's gaze, unflinching. I did. The warlord nodded slowly. Then, without ceremony, he reached for the blade at his belt and offered it forward. A warrior's weapon. A warrior's place. The room was silent as he accepted it. No one spoke. They didn't need to. He had passed the test. But he knew, deep down, there would always be another. The firelight flickered across the gathered warriors, casting long shadows on the metal walls of the warship's great hall. The air was thick with the scent of scorched metal and blood, a lingering reminder of the battle fought hours before. They sat in a loose circle, some nursing wounds, others sharpening blades, a few merely watching in silence. At the center sat the human, his hands resting on the hilt of the blade Var had given him. It was a warrior's weapon, not a gift, but a mark of acceptance. And yet, the air around him was still heavy with something unspoken. The warriors had seen him fight, had watched him carve through enemies with a brutal efficiency that unsettled even the most hardened among them. He had passed their trials, had bled beside them, but trust was not given so easily. Jorek, seated across from him, exhaled slowly, his mandibles twitching in thought. "You fought well," he admitted, his voice carrying the weight of reluctant acknowledgement. It was not praise. These warriors did not give praise lightly, but it was something. The human tilted his head slightly. "You sound surprised." Jorek huffed, a sound somewhere between amusement and skepticism. "I am." He tapped a claw against his knee, his gaze sharp, assessing. "Most who fight like you are raised for it, bred for it. You don't fight like one of us. You don't fight for honor or glory." Silence settled over the gathered warriors, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Eyes turned to the human, waiting for his response. His fingers tightened on the hilt of the blade. "No," he said at last. He turned his arms slightly, letting the firelight catch on the scars carved into his skin. Tallies. Countless lines, each one a life taken. A battle survived. I fight to survive. A murmur rippled through the circle. Jorek studied the marks as if seeing them for the first time. His eyes flicked from one scar to the next, his mandibles tightening slightly. "How many?" "You already asked me that," the human replied evenly. "And you never answered." A pause. Then, at last, "More than I ever wanted." Jorek's expression shifted just slightly. He glanced at Var, who had remained silent through the exchange, then back at the human. "Where?" "Everywhere." The fire crackled. Somewhere deeper in the ship, machinery hummed, the distant sound of metal groaning under the weight of its own existence. No one spoke. Then Var leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. His gaze was unreadable, his presence heavy, a force that demanded attention without needing to raise his voice. "Tell us." It wasn't a request. The human's fingers drummed against the hilt of his blade. He had never been one for stories. He had spent too many years trying to forget, burying the past beneath layers of instinct and necessity. But these warriors had given him something, even if they didn't realize it. A place. A chance. They deserved the truth. So he spoke. Not a home. There was none left to speak of. Not a family. Those memories were distant, faded things. He spoke of war. Of battles waged in the cold void of space, where ships became tombs drifting in silence. Of cities burned to ash, streets littered with the bones of those who had fallen long before the last shots were fired. Of trenches carved into alien landscapes, where the air was thick with the scent of blood and burning flesh. He spoke of the tally marks, each one a name he had never known, each one a life taken in the name of survival. There was no heroism in his words, no pride. He told them of the times he had killed because there was no other choice, of the times he had fought with nothing but broken bones and a rusted blade, of the moments when death had been a breath away, but he had clawed his way back again and again. By the time he finished, the fire had burned lower. The warriors sat in silence. Even Jorek, who had been so quick to question him, seemed at a loss for words. Then Var nodded, slow and deliberate. "You are one of us now." It was not a ceremony. There were no grand declarations, no oath spoken, just those simple words. But they were enough. Jorek exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Mad bastard," he muttered, but there was something almost like approval in his tone. The human let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He had spent his whole life being treated like an animal, a weapon, a thing to be used and discarded. But here, among warriors who had once looked at him with nothing but suspicion, he had found something different. Not acceptance, not yet, but something close. And for now, that was enough.